So let's see if we can do something with this. Dead Morose stood at the very edge of where the brittle grasses met the solid sheets of ice. There were plenty of spots just like this unremarkable one all through the tundra, driving further and further north out of the world of men. This border, this line in the ice, and the uncovered life, of cold places, marked the sovereign territory of the Grey Elves. Dead Morose had no illusions. He was one of them, even though he had lived and fought among them and for them for centuries. That was a long time, even for creatures. Let me fix a little typo there. Even for creatures who lived thousands of years with ease. Dead saw his breath. It meant heat inside his lungs. It didn't always happen when he exhaled, because though he looked like a man and maybe had been a man early in his life, he was something different now. He was something other than. He would always be a stranger among whatever people took him in. The other two stood back a few steps from the border. Dead toed with his fur boots. His weary, aged eyes stared into the snow blind distance. Alright, maybe a dash there. Okay. His eyes fooled him into believing all sorts of shapes and monsters prowled about the snow within his view. Delusions were very human, almost as human as seeing your breath. His ears captured the sounds of hungry howls rolling down the exposed swatches of mountains out at the edge of his field of vision. Those were no natural beasts, and their territory began out on that edge. From this distance, he could tell himself it was the wind he heard. It would not be a lie. There was plenty of wild wind making its own sounds through, say, across the top of the world. But it wasn't the truth. It was howls. They were hungry, and they were about to feed. And as he strained his ears, he heard the breathing coming from both his elbows, and startled. His heart thudded a drum beat in his ears as he only just noticed the gray elf leaders now at his elbows at the icy edge. All right. Elzarel on his right whispered, "You heard the cries of their parents, did you?" Dead Morose nodded. Rose Kerr on his left snorted like a beast of burden. His breath billowed out in great misty clouds. He probably saw his own breath every time. Russ was darker than the others of his kind. Almost dark enough to be... Just had a spider land on my phone. I am thoroughly freaked out now. Hey, Poggers. Oh, thank you for the another gifted sub. I meant to thank you a couple days ago, and I think I saw it late when it popped up on my stream manager there. But I appreciate your support. I hope the spider finds himself a way. I had one scurry into my couch the other day, and we tore the thing apart trying to get it out, and my wife wouldn't let us go back to watching TV until I got rid of it. So that took some doing. I don't like running into spiders. We have a lot of them around here, though. Russ was darker and others of his kind, almost dark enough to be mistaken for a dark elf, until you actually encountered one. I appreciate it, Aunt Poggers. Thank you. Almost dark enough to be mistaken for a dark elf until you actually encountered one. Zrel was as gray as the name of his kind. Age had much to do with it, but Dead Morose suspected that panned shade of his eyes, skin, and hair had always been there, giving him a ghostly countenance. I'm never going to spell this right the first time. Oh, the computer did it for me. Close enough, I guess. All right. Zrel whispered, Russ Kerr. Russ did not, however, back down. The humans must fight for themselves. The way we allow Dead Morose to fight for us all these years, you mean? We fought too, Russ said. And they cry for him to fight with them as well. Russ Kerr exhaled a slow cloud of air this time. Then he said, they beg for a hero to swoop in for them. Their are no human armies coming from their villages to save their children. All right. There are no human armies coming from their villages to save their children. They want a god or a genie to grant them wishes. After they have any survivors back, they'll forget their gift. They'll forget the gift and start asking for more favors, more toys from their benefactor. We've never asked anything of Dead Moreau's. We were not willing to fight for ourselves. Dead continued to stare out as if they weren't talking about him over him. Oh, appreciate the gifted sub. Thank you so much. Very much appreciate it. Dead continued to stare out as if they weren't talking about him over him. El Zarel said, just as he was free to fight with us or leave us to our own wars, he has his own choice of where to turn his powers, who to help, and under what conditions. I would never suggest otherwise. Us Kerr said, but I would point out that the peace we have long maintained is a delicate one. And his long stay with us means his actions will reflect on us with any old enemies he antagonizes. His choices can no longer be in isolation. His choices can no longer be played out in isolation. Your point is made and understood. El-Zerel said. I'd feel better if I heard it from him. Dead Morose sighed, but his breath remained invisible. He had been standing here a long time. He finally turned his head to El-Zerel and shook it. Ross Kerr cursed under his breath in a way most unworthy of their high kind. El-Zerel nodded back and said, "Your animals and sleigh are harnessed. Your weapons ready. We will protect our own borders while you are gone, and we will welcome you back if you choose to return." This is a really long introduction. I'm gonna have to cut a lot of it, I think, but we'll see. Maybe I won't. Okay. Dead Morose left the elder gray elves to argue among themselves. That was nothing new, even though the threat might change. He mounted his sleigh, strapping one whip to his side and using another to drive the reindeer forward. The ground scraped and scarred under the blades of his sleigh. Their hooves pounded on the hard ice and then picked up speed as the weight moved to the frozen ground. He guided them southward. From the land of the Grey Elves, everything was south. he centered them on the largest mountain. In time, they would veer toward the darkest canyon between, and finally the most deadly valley beyond. Hey, Otterly, thanks for being here, man. Enjoyed your stream earlier, watching you shoot it up with your friends there. Did you ever get red shields, man? All right. He took a moment to gather his other weapons. Daggers, an axe, slings, and more. As long as you tried. Problem is you're streaming though, so everybody can see your successes and failures in real time. Alright, he took a moment to gather his other weapons. Daggers, an axe, slings, and more. His gloved hand opened and closed over the whip. The distances made the mountains seem to never grow, running forever and getting nowhere, doomed to fail. They were doomed to be too late. Yet the sleigh drew into the canyon, and there was no denying the wild howls. There was no disguising the numbers he would face. No one guarded the entrance to that valley. They had harvested a great number of victims, and now they were whipping themselves into a frenzy in their feeding field. Dead Moreaus needed the beasts to carry him faster. There was a good chance the animals might not survive and might be food for the monsters as well. No need to save their energy under those conditions. However, Dead did not want to crack a whip and announce his presence before he had to. He either would be in time or would not. Either way, war was upon him. Death was coming. Death was coming for someone. Blood had been spilled, or would be shortly. The reindeer burst. The reindeer burst from the narrow walls and dropped down the steep slope into a place where shadows always ruled. Alright, Dead lifted his fist and allowed the leather braid thank you for another gifted sub. I appreciate it. Oh, you guys are killing it. Thank you, thank you. Alright, Dead lifted his fist and allowed the leather braid with sharp chunks of bone and rock to unfurl behind his back. He was surprised to see fear in their glowing red eyes as they turned their dark faces to him, rushing at them alone. Their curled horns caught what little light filtered in from above. They rose to their full heights and curled their claws. Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you. All right, they rose to their full heights and curled their claws. Now he saw the anger and rage he expected from these old enemies. First one growled out and turned its face to the sky to howl. Dozens of others joined in, then hundreds. The hard walls of the Crampi Valley echoed with the terrible sound. At that moment, his sleigh angled enough to see the human children gathered in the center of the pack of Crampi. They huddled together. Many weren't dressed well for this cold. Others appeared to be wearing the ragged remains of bedclothes. They had been snatched in their sleep, it appeared. All, I'll say many of these children were screaming in terror, but none could be heard over the dying howls of their captors. Dead Morose made a decision in that moment. He decided that he was willing to die here. He would take as many as he could before his end. If it was all of them, he would see these children home. If not, he'd hurt the surviving monsters until they could no longer enjoy their meals. He stepped off the moving sleigh in the snow. The unattended reindeer veered away from the threat before they ran headlong into the claws and teeth of the enemy. If he survived this, he'd need the sleigh to travel further south. They started to move at him in a wave, but he brought his terrible whip around, and the vanguard of Crampi suffered for their boldness. It turned out they bled red too, and from their slashes they spilled Christmas bright into the deep snow. Dead felt a wave of unholy joy as he heard them yip like little dogs. He brought the let's make it a new paragraph. He brought the whip round again, but they had retreated a few steps. He tore at the faces of three more unlucky monsters. As he swung the whip around a third time, a few brave creatures reached out to catch it. Others bowed their heads and offered their horns to tie up the studded leather. Dead pulled his arm up short and swung his axe from behind. Okay, hold on, let me fix some spelling, sorry. From behind his back with the other hand. A couple creatures lost hands at the wrists and stumbled over the other lines to escape. The blade rang off the horn of one of the ducked creatures, and it threw sparks. They snapped at him with their sharp teeth and powerful jaws, but not close enough to get him. It was an act of anger and frustration. They hopped about out of range, but he caught them circling around his flanks. He wasn't sure if this was instinct or strategy, but he couldn't allow it. Dead Morose whipped the flanking forces on one side and took the head off a Krampus. I know that should be capitalized because it's supposed to be a proper name, but not the way I'm using it, so the computer's going to have to get over that. Alright, on one side, and took the head off a Krampus on the other. One creature lunged in low and tore the skin on Dead's shin before it ducked back out of range, licking the blood from its lips. Another picked up the severed head and threw it at him. He had to duck. Alright, another came for his calf, but Dead split the back of its skull. With a quick move of his axe. In that moment, another was able to cut his bicep through his sleeve with the point of one arm. Not one arm, the point of one horn. Dead let out a yelp. Let's say a dog-like yelp of his own. The Crampi hooted and growled in response. They started to move in mass, but he whipped away their enthusiasm. They did not, however, back off very far. As he tried to circle away for some better range, they stuck with him, pressing their advance he needed to get his back to a wall. So he forced his attack to the right and started moving up that rocky slope as they pursued. His partial retreat encouraged them, and he had to fight and dodge all the more. They seemed to handle the hill better going forward than he did shuffling up and backward. Alright, let me fix a quick typo here. Alright, up and backward. Alright, our little character here is going to get himself into some trouble, so let's see what we can do with him. You got to put your protagonists into the position they don't want to be in. They seem to handle the hill better going forward than he did shuffling up and backward. Each time his heel caught an unseen rock in the snow, they dove forward at him. He had to keep his feet and drive them back at the same time. They never backed off as far as he'd like. As he'd have liked. I'm getting a tense problem here. Alright. Though they suffered for their efforts, he wasn't wounding them or killing them at deep enough, nor at a rate he would have liked. All right. As he gained elevation and the pack followed him up that treacherous hill, he saw the children gathered together and ignored by the angry monsters who brought them here in the night. They could almost stroll out of the valley on their own. Let me keep that the same paragraph. The sleigh and the deer stood waiting near the mouth of the canyon. the beasts would obey human children's hands upon their reins. Every direction was south from here. They just had to go. But they huddled in fear and would not move. He could yell at them to go, but the crampi would know then, and he doubted they would even move then. Dead started to think Russ Kerr had a point. They dove in to take another bite out of his flesh. He gave them another lash, but this time they wrapped up the braid and pulled. Their paws sliced and bled free, but they wouldn't release it. The others tried to attack as he stood leashed. Dead surrendered the whip to them and fought two-handed with the axe. He hurt and killed a number of them. But they got pieces of him too, and they greatly outnumbered his foolish army of one. Alright, I think we're in the home stretch here, but we need a little turn to come along. His axe buried deep in the skull of one Krampus. Oh, there it is, trying to capitalize that again. The axe buried deep in the skull of one Krampus that tried to ram him in the chest. He could not pull the weapon free, so he had to let that go too. They were too close on him for the slings, so he pulled a dagger in each hand. their hoots and howls started to sound like laughter. Their hoots and howls started to sound like laughter. It angered him as it filled him with dark fear. Arrows peppered the backs and the skulls of the crampi nearest him. As they fell, he shielded his face, thinking the attack was meant for him. The gray elven army poured into the dark valley of the crampi. Another volley of arrows dropped more of the monsters before they scattered down the slope. Dead realized they were charging for the children. They were either going to try to eat what they could or kill them for this offense. The gray elves surrounded the human children and fought the headlong, fought against the headlong assault of the surviving crampi. Among them, dead Moreau's spotted Russ Kerr pulling his sword, bloody, from a fallen monster. He realized he was more hurt than he thought as he limped down the slope. Elzarel came to his side and took Dead's arm over his shoulder to help. Dead tilted his head at the elder elf. Elzarel smiled back and said, "We could not let you fight alone after all the times you the elf lifted into the air on the horns of a Krampus. Again, we're going to keep that lowercase. His face contorted in pain, and he stabbed at the monster's head with his short sword, but there was no power behind the blows. The beast shook the elf above his head, spilling blood like hot rain that melted into the snow as it fell. Dead took on the beast with his daggers, but it wasn't enough to bring it down. Arrows filled its back like quills as more elven warriors ran to help. Ruzkur reached the scene as El Zarel fell to the bloody snow, pale and staring blank into the patch of sky over the valley, say over the deep valley. The Crampi fled through another pass with their numbers greatly diminished. The valley grew quiet, leaving only Ruzkur weeping over... Did I misspell weeping? Hold on. I did indeed. Okay. Alright, the valley grew quiet, leaving Ruzkur weeping over the body of the greatest of the Grey Elves. Joining him, the human children shivered and cried as well on the valley floor. After a great time, say a great deal of time, Russ Kerr rose and charged dead Morose with his bloody sword. I need to mention they killed that thing, don't I? Okay, let's say he cut the Krampus, the offending Krampus into pieces. Gotta mention this thing died. After a great deal of time, Russ Kerr rose and charged dead Morose with his bloody sword. Dead did not lift his arms. It wasn't clear if he did so by choice or because he wasn't able. A dozen elves stepped in to stop Russ in his tracks. They stripped him of his weapon and held his arms and body away from dead. Russ finally cried out, "Take your human pets. Take your human pets and be gone. Bring them back to the families who will never be able to keep them safe. We must return to our borders, because after all these centuries, we are at war with the Krampi again. Because of you, there will be more death and suffering for everyone. Go and serve your humans. Grant their wishes. Be their toy. You are not among us any longer. Russ Kerr pulled away from those who held him. He snatched his sword back. We're about done here. He snatched his sword back and stalked down the hill. The others watched dead Morose a moment Some of these fighters had known him most of their lives. More than a few had been there in the days when he rescued them from the brink. With the fall of El Zarel, Russ Kerr was now their leader, and things had changed in an instant. They carried El Zarel out of that valley. Dead Morose limped to the children and guided them to the sleigh. He covered them in fur blankets, but knew it would not be enough to get them back alive, to get them all back alive. Even as he mounted the sleigh, the howls of the surviving Crampi drew closer. He used the smaller whip to drive the reindeer out of the valley. They were eager to go. Dead had no desire to be caught alone again with the vengeful remnant of their kind. Out of the canyon and beyond the mountain, he turned the team southward to take the children home. He did not know the exact way, but from the top of the world, every direction was south. So there was only one way to go for now.